On today's episode of Forward with Truth podcast, I'm honoured to introduce our special guest, Jim Wells. Jim is a veteran figure in Northern Irish politics. He's renowned for his steadfast principles and his deep Christian faith. With a political career spanning over 35 years, he holds the distinction of being the longest serving member of the Legislative Assembly. Throughout his career, Jim has been a strong voice on social, moral issues and other issues with regards to ethics, consistently advocating for his beliefs with integrity and conviction. He served as Minister of Health, Social Services and Public Safety, where he focused on improving health services, on supporting public health initiatives. Additionally, Jim was a long-standing member of several committees, including the Committee for Health, Social Services and Public Safety, and the Committee for the Environment, where he worked tirelessly on issues ranging from environmental conservation to healthcare reforms. Jim's dedication to public service and his unwavering commitment to his values have made him respected and an influential figure, not just within his constituency, but across Northern Ireland. Today we'll be diving into his political journey and his life of faith, the challenges he's faced, and the principles that have guided him through his life and career. So, Jim, thank you very much for coming on.
I didn't recognise myself in that resume.
Yes, well,
used to be my poor PR man.
Well, this is it. Well, no, it's good to have you on, and obviously now you're retired, you've stepped back. Tell us, do you miss it? Do you miss it at all?
No, I don't. I thought I would, I'll be honest with you. I didn't retire, I was retired. The DUP decided I was surplus to requirements. And so therefore I stepped down actually just on my 65th birthday 2.5 years ago. And I thought I would be wandering around Stormont lost and lonely like a ghost from elections past. But no, I'm very fortunate. I've got 5 wonderful grandchildren and I've got a wife who is in care and I need to look after her. And I've found actually much more fulfillment dealing with their needs rather than political needs. I was actually at Stormont for 28 years, which is the longest anybody's ever been. I was also just a councillor for 17 years. And I'd done a lot, and maybe it was the right time for me to step aside. And I'm perfectly content in my present situation.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. And I think that's one of the things too, in that when you put your political career and family into perspective, family is the most important thing, isn't it?
Well, particularly in my situation, because my wife had a very serious stroke in February 2015 and has been in care ever since. And that was a huge, huge shock to the family and came a bolt of lightning out of the blue. And there's a huge degree of time commitment has now to be made for her needs. Yeah. And that means effectively I'm the one grandparent because my wife's not able to carry out what grandparents normally do. And as it happens, one set of grandparents in my family are from Switzerland and the other set are from Londonderry. So there's actually only me who's local to look after the grandchildren and family. But I find it quite fulfilling and I have no complaints. I had 28 years. The average political career in Northern Ireland is 8 years. So the fact I got 28 is good. And also, as Enoch Powell famously said, all political careers end in tears. Mine certainly did, but I'm one of many, many others who suffered the same fate. So I suppose I shouldn't be too surprised so it didn't end up with people carrying me sky up on their shoulders, cheering my every move. No, it ended quite abruptly, but maybe for the best.
Yeah. And it's probably a good thing you weren't a Roman politician, because theirs didn't end in tears. They're very often ended with a knife.
No, well, at times I wondered, but certainly... I had taken a very strong view on certain issues which the DUP found unpalatable, and that's surprising given their background. I have no doubt that had I not left at the time I did, I would have subsequently left because of other developments which I have found terribly disappointing for the DUP. Very, very disappointed in them.
Yeah. Well, look, maybe we'll move into, Jim, your early years. So tell us this. Can you tell us how what was your upbringing like, and how did you come to the Lord?
Well, I was brought up in a farming family in Moira, not from a Christian background. We were sent to the Church of Ireland. I have to be honest and say I don't think I ever heard the gospel preached once in the Church of Ireland in Moira. But then I went to Lurgan College, and the Scripture Union in Lurgan College was incredibly strong. I would say about a quarter of the school were members of the Scripture Union, which was an amazing situation. And I was invited along to the meetings, and I was very impressed with the message. And then after one of them, um, the chairman of the Scripture Union spoke to me, and started a train of events where I got more and more convinced that what he was saying was right. I then attended various conventions. Remember Leslie Hale coming to Lurgan? That wasn't yesterday. Um, and eventually I decided I had no difficulty in admitting that I was a sinner, none whatsoever. I was very aware of that. And when in 1972, I gave my life to the Lord after a Scripture Union meeting, and started down a very different path in life. Started to get very involved in Scripture Union, involved in Christian Union at Queen's, and through local churches. So a complete change. I met my wife, who was a fourth generation Baptist, which is very unusual, from Tobermore. We got married, and we started attending Moyer Baptist Church, which I found very supportive. So therefore, I'm very grateful to those who did intervene in my life to try and point me in the right direction. And that has given me a set of beliefs and principles that have stayed with me ever since, and have often got me into trouble. If truth be known, got me into very big trouble.
Yes, they definitely have. And I suppose, like, as well, you went to university, didn't you? And I'm sure, like many people who went to university, there were challenges, intellectually to your faith. How did you find that?
Well, again, at Queen's, there was an incredibly strong Christian Union. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of members, and a series of not only meetings for the Christian Union, but also each department had its own subgroup. There was also a lot of Christian activity in the university and in the Belfast area at that time. So I wasn't like some people who went, say, to university in England, were left very much on their own. I had lots and lots of Christian friends at Queen's, and it was very possible to have a very good and enjoyable life at Queen's in that culture without ever having to go to the students' union or get, take drink or go to discos or anything like that. And therefore, I didn't, I suppose, find it as difficult as others would. And I still, have kept in touch with some of those friends ever since. And many of them have gone on to great things. Many of them are clergymen, consultants in hospitals, have gone on to be really, really strong pillars of society. So I think to some extent we have that luxury in Northern Ireland, which others don't. And therefore, I didn't feel any sense of persecution at Queen's because you had strength in numbers.
Very good. Yeah, well, and I think there is that whole thing of community, isn't there? Because when you have sort of a Christian community around about you and you are all pursuing God together, that does really help in your Christian rules, so your Christian life.
And it's worth saying, Nathan, at that time, this is the late 70s, there was the sort of things we're now facing were unimaginable. Yeah. Things like we've now got abortion demand, we've got gay marriage, we've got proposals for assisted dying, with this whole issue of gender identification. Those were utterly unheard of in my time. And people who have looked at you if you'd said this was going to happen. So it's more recently things have become more difficult.
And I think the thing was too, I suppose there wasn't the same penalty socially or even financially these days by taking stands on those issues, although you did later in life take some of those penalties yourself. So I suppose maybe moving that on to, what role did the Christian faith play in your decision to enter politics, and how did that sustain you through your long career in politics?
It was almost total, because remember at the time that I joined the DUP in 1975, it was extremely well known for its very strong evangelical fundamentalist views. It opposed, for instance, the legalisation of homosexual relationships in Northern Ireland. It was consistently opposed to any attempt to bring in the 1967 Abortion Act into Northern Ireland. It tried to stem the reduction in the importance of the Sunday, the Sabbath. And the DUP were very well known for that. And I felt at that time very comfortable with their views. In fact, I suppose I would have held those views even more strongly than some of the leadership. And one of the reasons I thought I should get involved politically is to stop the that was occurring in the rest of the United Kingdom in Northern Ireland, and to support a party who at that stage I trusted to hold the line. And obviously been disappointed since. So I felt very much at ease with the UP's position right up to about 1995, 96. And therefore, and again in those days, there was a large number of people in Northern Ireland who supported you. Northern Ireland at that stage was made up of three groups of people. There was the people who are not Christians and who are out having a whale of a time on a Saturday night. There was the evangelicals who were supportive of the local church. And then there's a large group of people in the middle who weren't Christians but had a great deal of respect for Christian views and who wouldn't work on a Sunday and who didn't support gay marriage like that. What I have found over this last few years, that middle ground has shrunk dramatically. And therefore, you don't have that degree of support that you had from a wider sphere beyond churches. That is gone.
And actually, when you look at the stats, it is fascinating to see how, and this is a largely Protestant phenomenon, although not exclusively, that a lot of people have been very secularized who are Protestant now and do not have any sense of religious belief, and they're now declaring themselves to be non-aligned.
Yes, it's an ethnic Protestantism. In other words, I'm Protestant because I come from a Protestant background, but I would never darken the door of the church and not subscribe to Christian viewpoint whatsoever. But I still see myself as Protestant and British and loyalist. And I have been amazed, even in South Down, views which were unimaginable even 10 years ago, I'm frequently encountering, particularly amongst young people. And frankly, if the decision on a lot of these issues was based on the vote of the under 25s, they're all lost. They're all lost because young people simply don't get it, why these issues are perceived to be as important as they are.
Yeah, well, I suppose it's like that whole thing of you see it in the book of Joshua and Judges. It's the generation that does not know God, and I think there's a real work of evangelism that needs to happen at that generation, and there's a real work in terms of actually, because you can't expect them to hold the Christian ethics if they don't hold the Christian beliefs, and I think that has been one of the big problems, in our society today. So, as a man of deep conviction, who were the major influences of your life, both spiritually and politically, and how did that help, and how did that help shape your worldview?
Well, when I first met Ian Paisley, I thought he was the most amazing person. Even if Ian Paisley had been a plumber, I still think many, many people would have remembered him because he was a larger-than-life figure. There's no question about that. And I got to know people like Ian Paisley and William McRae and Ivan Foster, who not only were strong on the evangelical Christian faith, but also very strong in the need to protect Northern Ireland from the changes that were coming. Now, obviously, times moved on and even they moved on. But at that time, that's what attracted me to the DUP. I could have joined the Vanguard. The Vanguard was active in those days. And the Vanguard Party was a loyalist party, but with no Christian ethos whatsoever, just a loyalist party, though there were Christians in it. The DUP, when I first elected to Stormont in 1982, all of the MLAs were evangelical Christians, all of them, attending a variety of churches from Salvation Army to Elim to Free Church, etc. Again, that has changed, but again, I felt very comfortable because their views were very much in line with mine. Also, I found in South Down that, again, there was a large number of evangelicals supported me, and then a huge block of people who weren't Christian, but had a degree of appreciation and support for Christian views. But even in a rural area like South Down, that's disappearing, and it's getting harder and harder to hold the line. And things are happening that are, you could never have imagined, even in South Down 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah, no, that's right. And it's funny, we were having a conversation just before about the big man himself. About, maybe you want to tell us that wee story about the bookstore.
Oh, well, I used to travel around with the big man, happy memories. I remember one day he rung, we were at a gospel musical evening for the DUP in Cashin, Fermanagh. And we stayed till about 2 a.m. singing around the piano. And Doc leant over to me and said, "Young Wells, I want to see you at Aldergrove Airport at 8 o'clock tomorrow." I says, "That's fine, Doc. I'll go home. I'll have a lie-in. I'll have an early lunch." He says, 8 o'clock in the morning. I said, "Yeah, what?" And he had me at Aldergrove on a private plane at 8 o'clock in the morning. He flew to Glasgow for a loyalist rally. we paraded through Glasgow, and then we lost him. And the police, the Scottish police, were going bananas. Where has he gone? What's happened? I said to him, is there a second-hand theological textbook shop nearby? Oh, there's one round the corner. And we went into the shop, and there was Doc in the basement reading through all these old theological textbooks. So we knew he was safe when we got him home. He came home, and just put the date on this, he came home, he left me at Aldergrove, and he went to Londonderry to open the new Free Presbyterian Church. He came back that night and had a service in Crumlin Road Prison, and he did 4 services the following day, in Sunday, the Sabbath. And I crawled into the office on the Monday morning like death warmed up, and he bounced in full of beans. So that just shows you the dynamism and enthusiasm of the man at that time. He was an amazing character.
Just had an unbelievable constitution, didn't he?
He did. He just seemed, he acted like a horse. Obviously, he never smoked or drunk, but he just was an absolute goer. He said, he had done more work before 9 o'clock than most politicians. Absolutely certain of that. I mean, Doc had a lot achieved before 9 o'clock. And he just didn't have an off button. Also remember one night I met him at the Moyer roundabout, and he was going to speak at a place called Knocknadona Mission Hall, and I knew where that was, and I met up with him. And on the road up to Knocknadona, I said to Doc, well, what are you speaking on tonight? And he scratched his head and he said, I think I'll speak on the Great Divide. And that just came like that. And he stood up for 45 minutes and spoke the most incredible sermon about the Great Divide in the United States. Some of the rivers go west, some of them go east, and how we all have that great divide in our lifetimes. Absolutely amazing sermon, and he didn't think 5 minutes about doing that. So that was the amazing character that he was. Now, sadly, as times moved on, there were changes, but in his day, he was a phenomenal preacher, phenomenal.
Yeah, he had unbelievable gifting and constitution. And one of the great things is that you were talking there about the big man, that the worst vice that you could think of was that he was in a bookstore, in a Christian bookstore.
No, there were no skeletons in Doc's cupboard. I remember one night, a very sad instance, the Darkley massacre, and Doc rung me up and said, we're going to go to the hospital in Craigavon to meet some of those who had been injured. And I'll never forget, we were standing at the lifts in Craigavon Hospital, and each time the lift door, I was standing with him, the lift door would open and be full of doctors and nurses, and they all saw him, and none of them would step out. They all closed the doors, but none of them wanted him to get into the lift with them. They were completely shocked. But also, I remember that night, Doc could go through doors as Doc that no other person could get through, because no one would stop him. He had this ability to open doors, and people wouldn't contradict him or try to obstruct him. It was great fun and a great honour to spend time with him, and we had many happy memories. And I was just a rookie counsellor at this stage. I was of no significance, but highly enjoyable. And in each time, he was a great man.
Yeah, and on the personal level too, he was very, very gracious, and
he was wonderful dealing with the terminally ill. I've seen him going into the houses of people who had only a few weeks to live, and I just thought to myself, that was marvellous, just the way he was able to bring succour and support to them. And that was perhaps his strongest talent, to be able to do that. He was also, obviously went to the martyrs quite a lot, and he was just the most amazing speaker. And he had enormous talent and enormous energy.
Yeah. So you saw him you saw him dealing with people who were themselves going through tough times. Now, suppose yourself then, over the years, you've faced many challenges. You've stood firm in your beliefs, and your faith has guided you. How's your faith guided you in those tough times, and how has it guided you to make tough decisions, especially when your values were put to the test?
Well, I mean, I have had some dreadful instances in my life. My 3rd of February 2015, my wife had a very serious stroke and has been in either hospital or care ever since. And I found that very, very difficult to cope with. And then one of my children had a very serious medical issue, which is still with us, which I found very distressing. And then, of course, my political career simply disintegrated. I mean, it's simple as that. And it all disintegrated on issues. I was not prepared to budge on the killing of the unborn child, or on the issue of gay marriage, or gender identification. I just wasn't prepared to bend. I just could not live with myself. But even in the DUP, you found that that was beginning to become very, very unpopular. And I mean, people did say I was reactionary, I was narrow-minded, but I just could not see how we could bend on those issues, but we did. And unfortunately, sad to say, we've continued to go downhill on those. And so I paid the price. I paid the price, and basically I was dumped. And I suppose that was inevitable. But what I would say is, even if that hadn't happened, subsequent events would have convinced me to leave the DUP anyhow. I could not have lived with some of what's happened since. So therefore, there was an inevitability about it. And like yourself, there's quite a few people who at the end of the day just felt enough was enough and got out. And you have to live with yourself. And people say, well, could you not have been more rational? You know, could you not have bent with the wind? But I couldn't have lived with myself if I had. And I suppose inevitably I paid the price. And, you know, but I did get 28 years. So, you know, I can't complain. And I keep coming back. When you look at the careers of people like Mark Durkin and Danny Kennedy, Katrina Rowan, you look at Jonathan Bell, the Assembly's littered with people whose career was absolutely trashed and disintegrated. At least I didn't have the ignominy of being deselected by my local association. My local association backed me throughout all this, but the party interrupted that process and said, no, we're not having them, you're having this lady instead.
And how did you find, how did your Christian faith get you through those tough times?
Well, I think I'll use the phrase like, when I lost my political career, I said I'm like the extreme Calvinist who fell down the stairs and said, thank goodness that's over. In other words, it was meant to be, it has happened, and you just have to accept that it's God's will that has happened. And you pick up the pieces and you move on. And I can see a definite thread and trend throughout my life of things which could not have happened unless they were preordained. And therefore, my demise, I believe, was, you know, to some extent preordained. And I just have to accept, you know, that part of my life's over. It's part of God's plan for my life that happens. And maybe he's pushing me to be more caring for my family. Because I'm fortunate my wife was a very good mother to our children. Had I reared them, they'd been feral. You know, the point is that I was an absentee parent. And maybe I'm being directed to make up for those lost years. Because no one on their deathbed says they wish they spent more time in the office. And one thing that I do remember was that I only ever got to one school play for any of my children. And I remember that play very clearly because I stood in the corridor throughout most of it, trying to settle a dispute within the party in Kilkeel. And I was sitting on the mobile, fighting it out with various factions. And then I walked in as everybody was bowing and that sort of thing. I thought to myself, you know, that was silly what happened that night. Because I can't even remember what this dispute was about. So I'm very fortunate that my wife brought up the children very well. They've married or going with really, really good boyfriends, girlfriends, wives, husbands, etc. And things have turned out well despite me rather than because of it.
You've been a Christian in politics, well, elected for 28 years, but obviously you were an activist long before that.
Well, I went straight from Queen's to elected office, so not really.
not too long.
I was elected to the council at 23 and the assembly at 25, so I didn't really get much chance to live a normal life. I was briefly the youngest MLA ever, but another MLA, Jeffrey Donaldson, took that position off.
I think it's been probably beaten since then as well.
Oh, many times. Johnny Buckley was much younger.
Yeah, you know, good fella, Johnny as well. But for Christians in politics or in public life, what potential pitfalls are there for them, and what advice would you give? So somebody's maybe thinking about getting involved in politics as a Christian, or they are currently involved as a Christian and they're thinking, how do I live this life? Or not even just as a politician, but in public life in general. How do I live my faith in that public life without falling into the pitfalls?
I have to be despondent and say I think at the minute it's almost impossible if you're affiliated to a party, because all of the parties have now got policies which I would find almost impossible to sign up to as a Christian. the mainstream ones, Alliance, SDLP, students. I mean, you just could not, I think, as a Christian, sign up to those. And it's quite clear now the DUP, whilst it hasn't changed its constitution, is now doing things which I think I couldn't agree with. I couldn't support, and I couldn't even acquiesce to some of what's going on. So therefore, I feel, as an independent, yes, that's perfectly possible. But if you're going to be a Christian in political life in Northern Ireland, you will have a rearguard fight on your hands from within as well as from without. And I think if things move at the present trends the way they're going, then I don't see a place where a Christian can be heard and appreciated within a political party. I think, for instance, give the example of the position that a Liberal MP found himself in the Lake District, where he was hounded by the gay community to come out and say whether they felt that gay relationships were sinful or not. Now, he knew in his heart of heart they were, but he said, no, they're not. And that got him through the election, and then he had to admit, he'd lied. It wasn't true what he said. Now, I would find that I would simply have said they are, and I think you probably would have been deselected by any political party for saying that, even though that is the truth.
Yeah, I think, I mean, there is undoubtedly a trajectory, but would you agree that maybe there is a bit of fight back that we're seeing? So, for instance, issues like RSC, issues that you're seeing in terms of Wokism, you're seeing a move in the West against this this ideology.
Yes, because the pendulum has swung so far in the other direction. The difficulty is, yes, you can maintain a strong stance, but when you're asked about absolutely fundamental situations like creationism, I got myself in very difficult hot water by saying that I actually believed that the earth was created by God.
Yeah.
And that should be represented in an exhibition at the Jan's Causeway.
Yeah.
And I remember getting myself into very hot water by people who I knew believed that, but felt that it was seen as being controversial and alienating people. But the interesting thing about Doc in his early days was that Doc was absolutely strident on all these issues. And yet he always topped the poll, because even people who didn't agree with him respected him for the fact he was prepared to take a stand on issues which he sincerely believed. But I don't know at the minute, I mean, could I sign up to a party that acquiesced to abortion? Absolutely not. I couldn't do it. Yeah. Could I acquiesce to the whole gender identification issue and all the inherent problems with that? No, I couldn't. And that's the difficulty. And I think all political parties in the United Kingdom are going towards a common ground where things which were utterly unacceptable 20 years ago are now the norm.
But and that's interesting, because when Ian Paisley himself started out, what he was saying was, viewed by many as him causing trouble, maybe even veering on insanity, some of the things that in the early days. And yet what you've pointed out is that there's a man there who had the force of personality and the conviction, and that was attractive. Do you think that same thing could be replicated today?
Well, you'd need to have an incredibly strong presence and popularity to continue to get elected with policies which would be seen as unpopular. And I mean, obviously, I don't believe I've got that strength of personality, and I don't see too many others who do. Yeah. So therefore, some people will get elected despite their views, but the political system in Northern Ireland is such that parties are kept under control by the whips or by very, very powerful SPADs, special advisors. And if they say anything which may be orthodox Christian but unpopular, you'll be hauled in and said, look, that's not acceptable. Now, it's interesting, that only applies to Christianity. It doesn't apply if you're a Muslim politician or a Jew.
Well, it doesn't apply to any belief that is not secular or multicultural. There's that sort of multicultural secular ideology that, cannot be questioned.
Yes, and I mean, it's incredibly influential in the media and in the chattering classes. Yeah. And therefore, I think it's going to be very difficult. And I think a lot of Christian politicians will eventually be forced out. I mean, I'm just being honest with you.
Well, but I wouldn't be so sure because a lot can happen. Things can change. Like there's certainly no way in which I would have thought that America would be in the state that it's in, or Europe is in the state that it's in, and it just shows us that there's change that can always happen. You know, there are changes because there seems to be across the West and certainly across the world a move against this sort of secular mentality, like to the point that we've even had Richard Dawkins is now saying he wants to have some sort of social Christianity back.
Yes, and I think that we can move to that position. But what we can't do is undo the huge damage that's been done on fundamental issues where there's no going back. So your option then as a Christian politician is either to say nothing and keep quiet and just accept the flow, or to take a stand and say, look, no, hold on, I can't accept this, and basically end your career. I've no doubt that I kept my mouth shut and not come out publicly against this sort of thing. I think I would still be very much involved.
Yeah.
But there were people saying to me, look, we're depending upon you to put your neck on the block. Though some of those people, mind you, when they said that, then disappeared when the
block
when the thunderstorm arose, and you suddenly discovered you had very few friends. Most DUP MLAs and MPs haven't spoken to me since the day I left Stormont. The vast bulk of them. They don't have any association with me, just in case I'm not seen as just quite irrespectable. But I still think, in the overall scheme of things, it was the right thing for me to have gone when I did.
Yeah, sure. Given what we had discussed there on the whole issue of Christian ethics, you still are a commentator. You're an elder statesman in many ways.
Thank you very much. A younger elder statesman.
Younger elder statesman.
I do a lot of media work. I do interviews for radio, TV, and all sorts. I mean, I remember doing one for Bolivian television. I wonder what on earth they made it be over there.
Did you?
Yeah, I did one for Bolivian TV.
What were you talking about?
Oh, some crisis at the assembly. So that gives you about 50 options. I occasionally, when they can't get anybody else to do me, I do Nolan quite a bit because I've been many rounds with Nolan, and I think once you do a tussle with him and come out alive, then you get a chance to get picked. I do talk back. I did Radio Foil yesterday and so on. When I was the chair of the health committee, I set the record. I did 23 interviews in one day. The day that it was announced that 14 people had died from swine flu, and that had been kept secret, and I had found out and went on to the media. They were literally queued out the door, coming in, doing an interview for the lunchtime news, going broadcasting, and then getting back into the queue to do another interview for the tea time news. It was the most extraordinary time out. And then you begin to say to yourself, did I say that to this guy, or did I say it to the previous guy? So I have done an awful lot of media in my time, and therefore I'm not, don't get too anxious about it. I just do it. So I've kept that up since, and I think it's going to be quite busy over the next few weeks on the next big issue, which of course is assisted dying. Yeah. And there's absolutely no doubt that will dominate debate, both in the UK and in the Irish Republic over the next few months. Indeed, I noticed the Dáil yesterday voted by a slim majority to bring in legislation for assisted dying. Scotland's looking at it, Isle of Man, Jersey. There's a big vote coming up in the House of Commons. The difficulty about that is the history has shown that if all the countries surrounding Northern Ireland adopt a certain stance, it's very difficult for us to hold the line. And I see assisted dying as being a dreadfully difficult moral issue, and one that if we make the wrong decision, it'll change totally how we view the sanctity of life.
So, I agree with you. Now, I'm just going to play the devil's advocate here. Now, why would this be a problem? Because surely, Christians don't want to have people suffer, right? They don't have people suffer, and we want to have a situation where we alleviate pain. Why is assisted dying bad then?
Well, then Christians should be advocating a comprehensive palliative care system for Northern Ireland. You don't get calls for assisted dying for those who are in hospices, because we can, with modern science, largely negate so much of the pain and suffering involved in death. But even more important, we have the examples of places like Oregon, Canada, Belgium, and Holland, where we've had this introduced already. And we've seen the consequences of what has happened, to the extent they're euthanizing children in Belgium, and they're even offering assisted dying to people with mental health difficulties in Canada, regardless of whether they're learned.
I think there was poverty as well.
Yes, there was an example of a veteran who had no money. His life was destitute, and he was offered the option of assisted dying as a solution to his problems, even though he's perfectly fit and healthy. And the numbers are frightening, the way that, once this gains momentum. The other main reason why it must be opposed from a Christian point of view is, in 1967, we were promised that the GB Abortion Act was only for the very, very specific hard cases. The rape, the incest, and the person's, risk to the life of the mother. We've now had 10 million abortions in GB, 10 million. And it's abortion on demand for anybody, anytime, anywhere. And it shows that once you break the dam, as it were, once you accept the principle that a doctor's not only there to protect life, but also there to end life, you open the floodgates. And thirdly, you put many Christian doctors in very, very difficult positions, because they simply cannot do this. And as I say, difficult cases don't make good legislation. And I think what the whole push must now be to expand the enormously good work that's being done by the hospice movement, and to give everyone the option of hospice care rather than assisted dying. And I think that will reduce dramatically the pressure to alleviate suffering.
I was chatting to a couple of people who are involved in palliative care, medical professionals, and it's fascinating. They say that nearly everybody who does palliative care, whether you're Christian or you're not, they are the most resistant to this whole thing.
It is. All the colleges and doctors involved in palliative care are totally opposed to this. It's interesting that Wesley Streeting, the Minister of Health, who was in favour of assisted dying, has now looked at it in more detail, and he's come out against it. Anyone at the coalface of treating those who are extremely ill are opposed to what's happening. And, I believe we're at a watershed here, because you then undermine the whole principle of the sanctity of life, and that I don't think we as human beings have the power to intervene and decide someone's destiny. I have spent a lot of time in the hospices. When I was health minister, I made a point of visiting them, and I have to say I was extraordinarily impressed with the care. That if we go for assisted dying, the pressure to develop a proper system of palliative care disappears. Because why do you need it? Because you can just give them assisted dying. Now in Canada, it's got to the ridiculous situation that you can ring up your doctor will come out with a syringe and a blank death certificate. He will administer the drugs. He will then arrange for the undertaker to call for your body, and he'll do the paperwork there and then. Now, do we want to go down to that route, which is almost conveyor belt-like, and the numbers are rising dramatically? And isn't it something like 4% of all deaths in Canada are now assisted dying? That to me is a no-no. But the lesson from abortion is, once you break the dam, you can't control the flood.
But, of course, some people will say, but sure, do you not trust the medical professionals? You've got 2 medical professionals signing this. Can you not trust them?
I don't, because that's exactly the same argument for abortion. There was said that 2 doctors would look very carefully at the pros and the cons. No, they don't. They just sign the paper. They're busy people. They have other things to do. The lady wants an abortion. They're not actually worried as to the reasons or the need. And at the moment, with 10 million deaths of unborn children, we have total abortion on demand in the United Kingdom. And yet we were told by David Steele in 1967 it would only be for a tiny, tiny number of very difficult cases. That is not the case. So therefore, unfortunately, the lesson has been shown that hard-pressed doctors cannot be depended upon to hold the line on this issue.
Some will say that, well, hold on a second, this is the slippery slope argument. But the thing is, the slippery slope argument is not a deductive argument. It's not. You can't say this logically follows. But when you look at it empirically, it does follow.
Well, you only have to follow the examples of other countries who've gone down this route. And it's been absolutely shocking. And I think the Canadians are beginning to think, well, hold on, what have we started here? But you can't get the genie back in the bottle. And Oregon's another example. Now, Oregon is tighter but still the numbers are very worrying. And the Dutch and the Netherlands, it's just horrendous what's going on there.
You know, it was something you'd mentioned there about the whole mental health side of stuff. You know, we would you agree that this is a big problem that nobody's really talking about really at this stage? How does this impact, you know, a 16-year-old who's going through a difficult spell, and then, you know, or a 15-year-old, and their parents are maybe not even informed that they're going through this process?
And could be offered in some countries assisted dying, when all they need is proper counselling and care to get over this particular difficulty and then resume their lives. Yeah. And I think once particularly mental health becomes a criteria for assisted dying, then I think where the slippery slope is well and truly a steep one. So this is, there's important we have a debate on this, but I think it's absolutely vital we pull back, as we did in 2015. Westminster looked at all the arguments and by a substantial majority said no on a free vote.
Do you think that there is also big business involved in this as well? So could there potentially be benefits for businesses to profit from the deaths of people?
Absolutely. The Scottish Parliament are looking, they don't want to integrate this with the healthcare system. They want to set up clinics like Dignitas, albeit state funded, which will take this issue away from the health service, and the clinics will administer the assisted suicide. Now, clearly, there's an opportunity there for business to move in and to do that in the same way as the Pregnancy Advisory Council in the UK has basically taken over abortion entirely and has made millions and millions of pounds by doing the work that doctors don't want to do. And BPAS, it's entirely abortion on demand. So therefore, I see the attraction to the health authorities to have it at arm's length in the private sphere, because that takes away the conflict with their own staff.
Now, we've talked about a lot of the potential consequences. Fundamentally, that it's a compassionate, some are saying that it's a compassionate choice. We've looked at the consequences, why this is bad for society, even if you're not a Christian. But if people are listening in here who are Christians today, what biblical grounds is there to argue against assisted dying?
Well, I think Scripture's absolutely clear that before I knew that you were created in the womb, that we're not just a bundle of cells, we're God's creation. Scripture very clearly teaches that the decision as to when someone leaves this earth should not be the person themselves, it should not be their family, and it should not be a doctor. That it's only God's will as to when people die. Now, that having been said, I think it's perfectly Christian to enable the person to have as little suffering as possible. And I think the Christian ethos in this is to make certain that we do everything possible to alleviate the pain and suffering as a result of terminal illness. And the good news is that we have shown that that can be done. It just can't be done for everybody. Only a quarter of the people in Northern Ireland who deserve hospice care get it because we haven't got the capacity. But there's a simple solution to that, is to provide the capacity. And assisted dying will deflect from that. Yeah. So I don't think there's any difficulty with Christians wanting to help their fellow citizens end this life as quietly and peacefully as possible.
You said something interesting there, that a clump of cells were not just a clump of cells. Do you think that is ultimately the view of the secular world, at base level? That is what humanity is. Or what do you think the secular world sees humanity?
Well, the secular world sees a fetus as just a thing. It doesn't see it as a unique human being with DNA which is utterly different from any other human being, with huge degrees of potential. And we've aborted 10 million people in the UK. We have no idea how many of those could have been scientists, chief executives, even government ministers. The irony is, in Northern Ireland, we have a lot of people calling for abortion who wouldn't be here if we'd had the Abortion Act. that their mothers would have aborted them. So I think this is a line in the sand which I don't think any Christian could ever cross, and that is that we cannot take human life, even if there's good reasons for it. That is not our role. But we can make certain that the ending of that life is as pain-free as possible.
That's interesting, because I think when a lot of people from a secular perspective, now most people from a secular perspective, I have a high view of humanity. If they said that, they'd say I actually have a fairly high view of humanity. But the problem is, ultimately, when you look at the roots of secularism, and secularism is largely founded on an atheistic worldview. When you look at that atheistic worldview, ultimately humans are just an accident. And if humans are just an accident, if that's what secularism teaches, I know not everybody who's secular believes that, but that's what ultimately the sort of secularist worldview would believe. What do you think? What do you think Christianity teaches about what a human is?
Well, it would teach us that we're created in the image of God, that we're sinful. There's no question about that, but we have the potential to seek forgiveness for that sin and become part of His church. All human beings have that. Problem is, if that human being is aborted, there's no chance of it. And secondly, if it's euthanized, that chance is gone. So, I think all branches of Christianity and the Jewish culture would say that human life is precious. It's uniquely ordained of God. And once we start to tamper with that principle, then we are on the ultimate slippery slope. So if we have, now I know we've had 8,000 abortions in 5 years. So if we're ending life at the start of life and we're ending at the end of life, then where do you draw the line with people who are so terribly handicapped they have no real quality of life? What do you do there? Or have so difficult mental health issues? You're into eugenics there, and that's for me is the worrying trend. Which even though Northern Ireland will be the same as the rest of the UK, but only about 10 years behind. Yeah. So you look at what's happening in GB, and you can see it's coming our way. Yeah. So if they pass assisted dying in England, watch out, it's coming for us. Because the pressure, you'll be surrounded by countries. And the argument will be, but sure, they only have to cross the border or get the ferry to Liverpool. Yeah. So why don't we at least allow them to do it, have assisted dying at home in Northern Ireland?
And the problem is, it's not even just the safeguard of two doctors. Think of the pressure that this puts on, a couple of years in, an older person, what safeguards could there even be if an older person is sort of feeling, even internally, I'm getting too old here. Maybe it'd be better for me just to...
Well, I can give you two practical examples from my own situation. My wife was very, very seriously ill. On 2 occasions she was taken into hospital, and I was asked would I sign a do not resuscitate certificate, which would mean that the doctors could withdraw treatment. I said, no, I can't do that. The irony was the latest one was in July. I said, no, I'm not signing the certificate. My wife was at a Country and Western concert with me last Tuesday, having a whale of a time. So therefore, she made a complete recovery. So they got it wrong. She wasn't terminally ill, but she made it through. But I often wonder what would have happened had I signed that piece of paper. Would I have been assigning her life away? So the doctors don't always get it right in that sense. Secondly, and this is a different angle, you talk about people feeling under an obligation, they're a burden on their family. The average cost of care homes in Northern Ireland is £52,000 a year. And there are an awful lot of elderly people who are watching their entire life savings disappearing down a ditch called care home costs. Their families are watching this and they're seeing their inheritance, as it were, disappearing into the coffers of the care homes. And inevitably, you're going to get unscrupulous family members saying, look, really, you passed it, your life's come towards an end. Is it not just best to go out peacefully and quickly? Because this is just completely eating us up in terms of financially. And there will be elderly people who will feel guilty that they're doing that. Now, I can tell you from first-hand experience exactly what that's like, because the bill will arise on my desk on the 10th of each month with a thump. Yeah. And it has to be paid. And therefore, that's the dilemma. So to some extent, the old people not only feel a burden, they are a burden, but that should not come into any consideration. No. But that's what's going on. So you've got the doctors who don't get it right, and you've got the cost of the care of the elderly person. At the moment, what's stopping anything happening is it's illegal to intervene, to do anything about that.
Yeah. And that's, and I think that is ultimately the safeguard, isn't it, for the vulnerable? You know, that this law is not brought forward.
And the Shipman incident has meant that doctors will under no circumstances get involved in anything like that. Yeah. That they will do everything they can to protect life, because Shipman was so outrageous that doctors will not do anything which is perceived to be as hastening death. Yeah. They won't.
Now, I suppose we're talking about, and we have touched on this issue, and this has been something that I know you've yourself taken a very strong stance on, something that you've been given a lot of abuse for. It's taking a stance on the unborn life. Now, sanctity of life is central to both of these issues from a Christian perspective. And can you share your thoughts on why protecting the unborn is so important, and how the Christian worldview informs the stance on this issue?
Well, there's three issues. First of all, every child has a right to life, no matter what stage of the gestation period is involved. What we don't want is a situation in our hospitals where in one ward you've got neonatal nurses desperately trying to save the life of a 25-week born child, and the same nurses up the corridor killing the life of the same child of the same age. Secondly, in Northern Ireland we do have a lot of Christian nurses, doctors, gynecologists, neonatal nurses, and we never want a situation where you simply can't get a job if you're not prepared to do this. Yeah. You know, and we're putting people in a terribly difficult position. But thirdly, and more important than anything, is that once you breach the view that life is sacred and cannot be ended by a change in the law, then so much flows from that. Because if life can just be taken away either at the start or the finish at the stroke of a pen or two doctors' signature, then all respect for the sanctity of life disappears in society. And then you get on the slippery slope. What do you do with the people in the middle who have very poor quality of life, but they're not terminally ill? And there are people who are terribly handicapped and who have very poor quality of life. Do we then move to eliminate them through assisted dying? I think we're in a very, very worrying situation. But I think if London goes this direction, I think inevitably we're going to do the same.
And I think the thing is, even if it's opposed, the problem that we have is that Westminster can just, with a swish of a pen, can just install this in.
Well, that's what they did. They did it for abortion, to give Northern Ireland the most liberal abortion legislation in the United Kingdom. Yeah. 8,000 babies killed since. Also in gay marriage. Yeah. There was not support for gay marriage, but they just, at a stroke of a pen, did it. And then equally, the Irish Republic, who would have believed 30 years ago that the Irish Republic would have become as liberal? So once they went down a very liberal abortion route, well, people could get in a car and drive to Dundalk.
And even issues like victims as well, because this is, I mean, I suppose we're talking about part of the reason and the concern that I had with the commissioning of abortion. That was the reason I had, moved from the DP, was because there's a constitutional norm that set. Because once you have Westminster interfering in the basis of a devolved administration, it won't stop there. It'll continue to happen. Yes. And I think that's the problem that we have. But so what would you say to people right now? Okay, we have this happening in the Dáil. Some of our viewers may be from the Republic of Ireland. A lot of them will be from Northern Ireland. What would you encourage people to do to try and stop this?
Well, I still think we're called to be the salt of the earth, to try and influence decision makers, be they Christians or not. So whilst sadly an awful lot of what we've predicted has happened, we are still, I think, commanded to intervene and to at least say, not in my name. So therefore, I think on the assisted dying, I think there are a lot of MLAs out there who could go either way if it's a free vote.
Yeah.
Now in Westminster it is going to be a free vote, and I think the Dáil's the same. So in a free vote in Northern Ireland, you may well get people who will actually look at the arguments and vote with their conscience. If it's whipped, then I'm afraid it's lost, if it's whipped. So, but I mean, and there, for instance, Ulster Unionists, I would say some of them could be swayed either way. And there's some DUP who I think would vote for assisted dying, but if there was enough pressure, they wouldn't.
So what you would say is, whether it's a person in the Republic speaking to their TD, or whether it's somebody in Northern Ireland speaking to their MLA.
It would be MLA rather than MP, yeah.
Because of the influence that Westminster has, would you still say that in this vote it's important to write to your MP and encourage them to participate in representing their views on this?
Absolutely, because it'll be important how the MPs who are at Westminster, of course it's only 9 of them or something, or 10, that they do, quite clearly say we're not having this for UK generally and for Northern Ireland, and hopefully that'll act as an example for the MLAs who will then undoubtedly have to face this issue in the coming years or even the coming months.
What would you say then to the church, right, and the pastors about this issue? Is there, obviously churches shouldn't be party political, but do you think this is an issue that the churches should be speaking on as well?
They should, and indeed I have to say the Anglican bishops in England have come out with very strongly against this, which is a bit unusual, but it's happened. I have no doubt there's certain denominations in Northern Ireland, like Presbyterian Church, the Free Presbyterian Church. I would like to see the other evangelical churches, the Baptists, for instance, and the Pentecostals, coming out very forcibly against this, because this isn't party political. This is expressing the views of their congregations and membership. And if you can't take a stand on assisted dying, well, frankly, what are you going to take a stand on?
Well, do you think that there's potentially things that, pastoral situations that pastors themselves are going to be faced with, in their own congregation?
Undoubtedly, a pastor is going to face a very difficult situation where the family are very keen to convince their loved one that assisted dying is the best route, and the pastor will know that morally he couldn't possibly sanction that or agree to it or support it. And, being a pastor is difficult enough without facing that situation. I must say, when my wife was in hospital, I was impressed by the large number of clergy who were in hospital regularly, giving support to their congregation. And, do they want to be faced with that ultimate dilemma, that a decision's been taken which they know is fundamentally wrong? I still feel, mind you, that some of our evangelical denominations could take a much stronger line on these issues. I think they don't. When I was at Queen's and when I stood for election, one Christian lady said to me, "I don't smoke, I don't drink, and I don't vote," as if voting somehow tainted you. Even you don't reveal who you're voting for, but also even voting for an immoral issue is seen as not quite the thing to do. Well, I think in this issue, the churches with a clear conscience must come out and say, this is biblically absolutely wrong. Yeah. And I can't see there being any ambiguity in this. I can't see how anyone with an evangelical Christian stance can see it anything but wrong.
Yeah, and I think, would you agree that sometimes churches get this mixed up between what is political and what is prophetic? And I mean that not in any sort of Pentecostal sense. I mean it in the sense that they're declaring the word of the Lord, so from the Bible, so the biblical view on this issue.
And we're called to do it, and Scripture shows that they're great pillars of the gospel who said very unpopular things and ended up being imprisoned or killed for it. Yeah. But if they hadn't taken that stance, the church wouldn't be where it is today. Yeah. So I think there is a role for the Christian church. And, even if you lose, at least you have defended the cause. Yeah. But if you don't take a stance at all, well, then you can hardly be expect things to remain constant.
Do you think, so Jim, just on that issue, do you think that part of the problem is that the church today doesn't see the conflict as what they see this as a political issue rather than an issue of where truth is at stake? You know, Luther, the cultural issue was, you know, justification by faith. At the time of the early church, it was Jesus is Lord, not Caesar is Lord. So do you think that part of the problem is that they don't see that this is the doctrine of humanity under attack?
I think our church is at ease in Zion. I think they're quite comfortable with their services and their meetings and their youth work, but they are very, very worried about taking a stand. And I have to say, for instance, the Free Presbyterian Church in the 70s and 80s would have been out there with the protests and the clarion calls to oppose this sort of thing. Even they now are very reluctant to do that. And somebody told me a very interesting story about an evangelical denomination, and I asked, why is the sanctity of marriage and the importance of people getting married and settling down rather than just living together, why is that no longer preached? And one minister said, if I did that, half the congregation would leave. You know, they're scared because, you know, it's now seen as the norm, even in Christian circles, just to move in together. And I mean, that's very sad that has happened. So therefore, you know, they don't want to rock the boat. They want to keep it internalized. And they do not want to be seen to be taking a stand. I think part of the problem is in the Irish Republic, the Catholic Church, which, you know, I wouldn't agree with at all, but the Catholic Church would have in the past taken the stance against these moral issues, and they've lost all credibility because of the abuse scandal. So therefore, you know, that means that the Republic will inevitably go down the road of this liberalisation. That will spread into Northern Ireland because the argument will always be, well, you know, if you're living in Strabane, you can go to Lifford and do anything you want. So therefore, the churches are not going to upset the apple cart, as it were, and take a stand. And that is very sad because if they don't, there's no one else to do it. You know, I must say I found it a wee bit difficult at times. I didn't feel an awful lot of support from the churches for my stance either, because they didn't want to be associated with controversy. Yeah. You know, but when Paul was in Athens or in Corinth, if you'd taken that attitude, where would we be today?
Yes. No, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Fine. So I suppose we've talked a lot of heavy stuff. What are you doing tomorrow?
Well, tomorrow I'm taking 24 people from Ballycastle to Islay. Oh. Islay is one of the top sort of wildlife locations in the UK, and we've got 2 boats going at 8 in the morning. So I'll be up at about 5:30. I have a huge interest in wildlife. I think they ask the average MLA what his interest outside of politics is. Half would say reading the Irish News and the other half would say reading the newsletter. That many of them don't have any interest outside of politics. Well, I've always had this interest in wildlife. It led to a fascinating situation a few years ago where we got a picture of a very unusual bird near Macrafelt of all places, and I took it in to be framed, and I was collecting the picture. The guy behind the desk said, well, what's your name? I says, Jim Wells. He says, funny, I've been listening to that other Jim Wells and known this one, you know, that idiot from the DUP. He's speaking the biggest load of nonsense. And I went, oh, right. Now, if I had any thoughts in my head, I should have said, I hear he's very good. But he didn't twig on. It was the same person. Now, had I brought in a picture of Arlene Foster to be framed, which would have been unlikely, but if I'd done that, he would have instantly recognised who it was. But even people on these boat trips will occasionally ask me, are you related to that boy Jim Wells up at Stormont? And the other thing which is quite shocking is I'm left Stormont now 2.5 years, and I still get at least a call a month from people who don't know I've left. Who's still, what wrong with the other day? What about that debate? What's going on there? Or they ask me to raise some issue, and then you tell them you've gone. I say, what do you mean you've gone? You've always been there, you know. And I have to very quietly and gently say to them, I'm out completely. So the wildlife has been a great source of contentment to me. But we've got a lovely bunch of people who go with us. A lot of them Christians. And we have fantastic times, and of course there's no conflict. It's just a nice day out. Tomorrow, so we're going after barnacle geese and seagulls. Oh, very good. Very good. So, and as I say, we've got 2 boatloads, and we'll have a great time, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Yes, I think it's quite funny too, because I think people sort of wouldn't put the whole issue of somebody who's quite into environmental protection, and looking after bird watching and all the stuff that goes with that, and somebody who is from a conservative evangelical perspective.
Well, how do I marry those? The more you get to know about the complexity of wildlife and the amazing variety and complexity of that wildlife, it gets harder and harder to be an atheist. Yeah. It gets incredibly difficult to believe that it all came together by pure chance. Yeah. That from one cell that developed into what we have today, you see a divine hand of creation there. And therefore, that's how it does marry together. And a lot of those who go with me would have the same view. And each time you see something, you go, wow, how could that have happened without divine intervention?
So you would, even your interests outside politics, it is as a way to worship God.
It is, though you need to be careful you don't end up worshipping the creation rather than the creator. There's a lot of people, in various environmental movements, they've almost made the creation a religion to worship. Yeah. No, you don't. But it does point to what the world was like before the fall. Yeah. We're only seeing a small glimpse of what it was like. Yeah. And I just marvel every time I see things going on in wildlife. Most of my colleagues in Stormont thought it was a bit weird that I had this interest, but it meant that when things did collapse on me, I was straight on my back packing up the moorings. Yeah. I had so much to do and so many interests, and I've developed some really, really good friends. Yeah. People I never would have met ever outside of this. Yeah. So tomorrow we'll have chief executives, we'll have medical consultants, we'll have teachers, headmasters, etc., all going off and having a jolly good
time looking at God's creation. Yeah. And having a bit of lunch, I'm sure.
I did make one fatal mistake once. We took a group to Isla. Isla's very famous for its distilleries. Mm-hmm. There's 9 distilleries in the island. And we landed at a pier beside a distillery, and there's 13. And I said, right, folks, you've got a choice. You can either go on the tour of the distillery and get all the free samples, or come bird watch with me. 12 of them went round the distillery, leaving me on my own. So they'll never be given that option again. I can assure you that'll never happen. We no longer land at the pier beside the distillery.
Yes, because that's the one place in Ireland you wouldn't be interested in
going. None whatsoever.
Well, here, Jim, thank you so much for coming. We really love to have you on the show and on the podcast today. And look, we wish you all the very best on your trip tomorrow, and also we want to wish your grandkids and your children and your wife all the very best as well. So thank you again.
And I want to say that I was one of the first people on your podcast before you became famous.
The first?
Oh, the first? Oh, gosh. What an honour. Well, I want to be able to say, you remember that fellow Anderson before he was really famous? As he's more famous now than Jerry Anderson.
I think we're a long way from that, but here, look, thank you very much for coming.
No problem.